Thank you very much, Andy. So hopefully by now everyone should be aware of the work that ourselves and Andy have been involved in for the DFT during this COVID-19 data response. Next slide, please. So I'll just keep it really brief in terms of what the overview was, because I think we've done a number of these presentations in the past couple of months. So I guess the initial request for work was driven by the government to report on the impact that COVID-19 was having on the network and allow them to make more informed decisions on what the virus was doing. And although the DFT were well informed about what was happening on the strategic road network, there was really low, fairly limited visibility of what was happening on the local road network. And so through Darren at the DFT and a lot of our media partners and Andy as well, we put out a massive call to arms to all the local authorities, and various other transport agencies and organisations got involved, and we got a really positive response with a large number of local authorities and other data providers offering data sets to support this effort. So through the Transport Technology Forum, the DFT approached Arup, ourselves with Andy, and we requested and we led the production of a data pipeline to help them understand what the impact was. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go, I guess, through some of the timelines about the various bits and pieces, and I obviously won't dwell too much on this opening steps. I've just covered them. But yeah, after this initial call to arms, we had a really good response very quickly, with 26 data providers covering 35 local authorities within just a couple of weeks. And that data was from ATCs, Bluetooth, ANPR cameras, and it was we all just reviewed them about what was able to be consumed, trying to use a baseline of February 2020 for all our analysis to be able to do a pre-COVID and post-COVID sort of a comparison. And we wanted to make sure that everything was repeatable. So as far as possible, Python scripts were used and other sort of automation. Next slide, please. We then incrementally increased the sophistication of the pipeline with more data, more different sources, wider range of data of national coverage, and we developed this sort of back-end database system to be able to do more advanced analytics on the data and really show different visualizations easily. And within that, validation, which Leanne will touch upon later, was having to be introduced as well, because there's obviously a case that we are presenting the data, but the data's not Arup's, it's not DFT's. Therefore, we're having to pick out where there were sort of issues with any of the data sets. Next slide, please. And so from, I guess, autumn last year, we've continued to deliver weekly digests, which I hope that some of you on this call have seen in the past. And where possible, we've been producing more localized and specialist analytics to help out around particular restrictions and lockdowns. The latest weekly digest got published yesterday, so do look at the TTF website if you want to see that. We also commenced some of the parking stream of work, which I lead, and that's looking to do some manual classifications of parking sectors, as well as just capturing data from a wide range of sources and suppliers. Next slide. And yeah, as I was saying, the recent focus is around active travel and parking data sets, and really trying to use, I guess, that sort of data as not so much to say what's happening on the network now, but to sort of use it as a barometer of economic recovery. And parking data, as some of you may well know, presents a pretty big challenge for people trying to deal with it because of, well, one, the commercial issues and sensitivities, and also because it's not consistent. So different suppliers and organisations have different levels of access to data, which presents a really big issue and lots of complexities when we're trying to do that. So, but what we've also been doing is, still producing those digests, and that's still available. Next slide, please. And I guess just to finalise from the sort of opening about the project, so we're regularly consuming 3 different types of data. A 4th one in freight was consumed last summer. We've got over 90 different data providers who we've talked to. We've had 40 local authorities mobilise and actively offering us data. And we're producing weekly insights into what happens and the differences in the transport network. And not on that slide, but I guess slightly arrogantly, we can say that we also won the ITS UK Project of the Year last year, which is obviously a nice thing for us as a project and for the TTF. Over to Leanne.
Thanks, Martyn. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So I'm quickly going to take a look at some of the actual insights into the traffic data and the cycling data that we've actually seen during the pandemic over the last year. And as Martyn said, we're comparing to a pre-pandemic baseline, which is really that first week of February. And people might ask, why don't we compare to exactly the same time last year or the previous year? And that's because this data set didn't exist before February 2020. So that's why we have to use that as our baseline. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is really a graph of the median of across all local authorities that are providing us with data, and it's showing a percentage change against that baseline from February until present. And you can really see that first dip that you see in the data, a dramatic 76% decrease in traffic that we saw during the first lockdown. And then the traffic kind of starts to recover between sort of July and October, but sort of not quite recovered, kind of 15 to 20% below the baseline levels. And then you can see a second dip there during the second national lockdown. Interestingly, not as decreased as we saw during the first lockdown. And then on the 20th of December, it was announced that London and the Southeast was going into Tier 4 restrictions. And we saw another large decrease in traffic, and obviously around the Christmas and New Year bank holidays. And then we went into our third lockdown on the 5th of January, and we've seen traffic levels not quite as low as the first lockdown, but definitely not at the same levels as the second lockdown. So very, very interesting timeline to see over the last year. If we can have the next slide, please. So this graph is really about trying to observe the changes in the sort of AM into peak and PM peak periods. So this is an average hourly traffic count, and we're looking at particular weeks, and this is also weekday traffic. So if you look at the very top blue line, that's a week before the pandemic. So you can see very pronounced AM and PM peaks there, and then the very bottom line, the purple line, that was during the first national lockdown. So we really just saw those AM and PM peaks completely disappearing almost, and then interestingly, the second national lockdown, still quite pronounced AM and PM peaks, is that green line in the middle. And then the three sort of red lines on top of one another, those are the previous 3 weeks. And you can see we're kind of still quite low in our traffic levels, and we've got kind of starting to recover AM and PM peaks, but not quite as pronounced as we've seen before. Next slide, please. So this graph is trying to compare the 3 national lockdowns in terms of their timelines. So we've taken the week before each lockdown and plotted them on the same timeline. So we can really see that green line, that's that first national lockdown, very dramatic decrease, sort of maintaining the same levels, very slowly increasing towards the end. The second national lockdown, very interesting, is the blue line. We can actually see there's a slight peak right before the decrease in traffic during the lockdown. Which we think was probably due to businesses mobilizing before the closures, people moving to different locations to isolate. So there was a slight increase in traffic before it went down. And then the orange line is the third national lockdown. And just to compare, there's a dark shade and a light shade of every color. And that lighter shade is really comparing the DFT national average data, which contains data from the strategic road network, so the highway network. And against the TTF data, the local roads data, which is the darker line. So we're starting to see in this third lockdown that we have less travel on the highway network than we do on the local roads network. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick look as well at cycling. So against the baseline, we can see that it's very sensitive to changes in weather. We've kind of tried to mark out all the bits there where we saw wet weather, but it's very hard to tell. We've had a lot of wet weather now in the recent months, but we saw a dramatic increase in cycling over the lockdown period, especially over the summer months. And next slide, please. Over to you, Martyn.
Thank you, Leanne. Next slide, please, Warren. So the overall trend for parking has really unsurprisingly been fairly similar to what's been seen within traffic and the cycling datasets. At its peak back in April, the parking levels were around 82% what they were back from that February baseline. But the subsequent lockdowns have shown that the decrease after a lockdown is far less significant. So I guess if we're looking at what's the new shape of parking and what's changed, well, one, the lockdown parking levels are higher now at these subsequent lockdowns. but the increases following the decreases following the announcements of restrictions are still significant, and the effect of sort of a recovery post the announcements is still to be seen, or still being shown. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, the driver for the car park data at the moment is the idea that data sets will be used as an indicator of economic recovery. So being able to display the data by sectors is really quite powerful for us. We do also collect data from across the regions and be able to show the differences between sort of the northwest and the southwest. But just due to the tiered system and the sort of the amount of data available and the type of data that is available, the regional differences are really not that significant, and they all show a very similar trend line. So it really is looking at sectors is where we see more the differences. I appreciate this is quite a busy graph, so I don't expect everyone to be able to understand what's going on, but it does show that in March 2020, across all the sectors, there was a significant drop-off in the overall car park numbers. Next slide. So hopefully this is a bit clearer, this graph. So really, what's changed? What's the new shape of parking in terms of sectors? So as you can see, health, which is the sort of orangey line, after initial drop-off, it's basically plateaued since April last year. So it is, the numbers are less of people using hospitals and doctor surgeries are less than maybe in 2019 and early 2020, but the effect of the restrictions and the easing don't really have a huge impact on the levels. And it can be seen from the drop down in March that the impact of the lockdown announcements back in March 2020 can be seen across all the sectors. But the phenomenon around everyone panic buying can be shown with a massive spike around the same time in the supermarket numbers. This has sort of been shown in the subsequent lockdowns as well. The supermarkets are actually which is the red line, is actually quite interesting, because since April, there's really not been the impact of the announcement of restrictions has really not had an impact on the numbers overall. And the biggest impact on the actual numbers of people using supermarkets has been Christmas, and with retail and supermarkets showing a huge spike around that. So how are we saying that supermarkets use has changed because of the lockdown announcements? Well, doesn't look like it has significantly since April and the start of lockdowns and the start of this pandemic. As we're a transport industry, just touching on the transport numbers, which is the sort of darker blue line, and that really shows that the numbers haven't really recovered to pre-pandemic, and it's quite sensitive to the announcements that get made by the government. Next slide, please. So just trying to look at sort of the changes in when people park per hour. And I guess looking at comparison of the parking levels from before the pandemic in the light blue against April last year in the purple and then November in the green, it can be seen that really the recovery hasn't been the same, and there's now not that significant morning peak as there has been previously. There's obviously many reasons for this, which I'm not going to touch upon now. But I guess that what we can show and can say that really that the lockdowns that we're experiencing now is quite similar in terms of the parking behaviours, in terms of when people are parking, to the previous November lockdown. Over to Leanne.
Thanks, Martyn. If we can have the next slide, please. So we're quickly going to take a look at the kind of lessons learned and the key challenges that we experienced while we were actually building this data pipeline. I think we're running a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to go next slide and the next slide again, please. I'm just going to dwell on this slide. So the key lessons learned really are that we're super reliant on the goodwill of all the people who contributed data. So all of our independent data providers, our local authorities, everyone involved in contributing that data was really, really important at the beginning to just get as much data as possible to be able to build this product. And then actually having that engagement from local authorities throughout the process was really important to us to be able to ensure that we always had access to all the systems that contained all the data, and that we just always had that continuity. We would like to try and share this data in the future. There's quite an appetite amongst people to get access to this data, but obviously we've been given this data for the purpose of DfT COVID impact monitoring, so we need to be careful about how we share that, but it's something we want to look at in the future. It was a real challenge because all of these data sets came in so many different systems and different formats. that we really just, it was a challenge to pull it all together into a standardized schema. So we're quite proud of the fact that we've managed to do that. And we recognize that validation is a really important part of quality assurance. We had to come up with a list of criteria to make sure that we could have good quality data sets that were consistent and didn't have any sort of erroneous sensor data in the outputs. And the other thing is that automation is really at the forefront of our minds in this development. We really do prefer data sources that are available through APIs or automatic feeds. So we are hoping to sort of work with authorities that are doing more manual input data in the future to make everything more automated. So I'm going to close off there and just hand over to Martyn to tie this off. Thanks.
Yeah, so as previously mentioned by both Leanne and I, we're producing these weekly digests. So as I said, the latest one's is currently on the TTF website, so I can share a link to that afterwards. But this really is also a chance for us ourselves to put out another call for data and call for help. So I think quite a lot there's people on this call who are already providing us data, that some of our panelists later on are providing us data. We really appreciate it so far. So if anyone has any data sets and would like to support, please let us know. I guess we're in particular focusing on cycling data sets or parking data sets if you might have anything available. So next slide, please. So yeah, if you have anything, do reach out to myself, Leanne, Andy will put his details later on, or just use the generic TTF website email address. Thank you very much.